Hi, everybody. This is Ignatius, Editor-in-Chief of Harvard Business Review, and welcome to another episode of HBR Quarantined. I'm joined by my co-host, Joshua Macht, who heads Product and Innovation at Harvard Business Publishing. This show was created several weeks ago to connect with all of you who are still in lockdown, to try to give you insight on what's happening in the world of work and in business and with the economy. Our special guest today is Samatha Power, author of a few books, including the Pulitzer Prize-winning A Problem from Hell, America and the Age of Genocide. She was the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations from 2013 to 2017, so we will bring her in a second. But before then, Josh, I just want to talk a little bit about where we are right now. So we're just past Memorial Day weekend in the U.S. We saw the pictures of people hitting the beaches. This strikes me as a period of risk. The New York metro area, where a third of the cases and a third of the deaths occurred, seems to have succeeded in flattening the curve. The rest of the country is continuing to see cases rise. That's true globally as well. But we're going back to work. So this is really a reminder to myself, as much as anybody else, this is a time not to relax. We know the workplaces that are the most dangerous, those with poor ventilation, meatpacking plants, nursing homes, prisons. We know where the risk is, but the risk is everywhere. And we're going to start going back to work, but we're going to be facing risk. And, it's important to stay vigilant to avoid a deadly second wave. That's a pretty serious way to start. But Josh, let me kick it over to you. What are you thinking right now?
Well, no, I mean, I agree. And I think we sort of all saw the pictures of Memorial Day and people on beaches and whatnot. And, it does give you pause, because we all have, there is this fatigue for sure. But at the same time, you want to keep reminding yourself, we've got to be vigilant. This is a long, long way from over. I'll tell you the one thing, though, that for me, Audie, and I'm curious if this is the same for you. For me, it's like a long weekend where you come back, it's nice out, and you don't go to work. It's just a strange feeling. I mean, in some ways this morning I felt more disconnected than I have in the past. With people you normally, after a long weekend, people sort of slowly trickle in, and you'd have that, conversation about where people had been and just normal workplace things. That it's sort of a glaring absence right now. I don't know if you feel the same way.
Definitely feel the same way. And we've talked about this before, that it's the transitions, the commutes or the clear breaks between weekend and weekday that are gone now, and that make our life seem, a little bit Groundhog Day, a little bit repetitive. And, and then just absolutely missing the kind of casual interaction in the office is a tough thing.
Yeah. Sure.
Let me remind our viewers, if you want to pose a question to Samatha Power, put your comments in the comment box. Put a question rather in the comment box. Before we bring her on, we always like to show a TikTok that captures the zeitgeist. So, Engineer Dave, if you could roll a TikTok that sums up what it's like on week 11 of lockdown.
I know, and I can't tell the difference between a weekend and a weekday, and I barely remember what real pants feel like anymore. Right? It's crazy. It's wild. Anyway, did you get my email?
Yeah, so we've all been that guy. We've all seen that guy, and that's sort of what life has been like on this loop for 11 weeks. So, one thing quickly, if you like the show, it's free, obviously. But if you like what we do, feel free to subscribe. Go to hbr.org, and you can subscribe to all aspects of Harvard Business Review. If you're a sponsor and you're looking for a really great opportunity to get your message across, well, you'd be hard pressed to do better than this, Josh. Don't you think that's?
Oh yeah, this is your spot. This is your chance.
Yeah, it's true. All right, so let's bring in Samatha Power. She, as I said, she's the author of the Pulitzer Prize-winning book, A Problem from Hell, America and the Age of Genocide, and she has a new memoir called The Education of an Idealist. She was the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations from 2013 to 2017. And was involved, importantly, in the global coalition that responded to the Ebola epidemic in West Africa 6 years ago. So, Samatha, welcome, and thank you for being here.
Great to be here.
So why don't we jump in? Talk a little bit about, where are you? How are you handling the work-life balance that everybody watching is coping with as well?
like many, in a time of political polarization, my own emotions are very polarized. I feel immensely lucky. We had a very serious scare in my family with somebody very close to me getting COVID and having a brutal few weeks. But he's made it out and is very much on the road to recovery, we hope. Although all the science, we've never had this experience in our lives of seeing science, hypotheses, experimentation kind of playing out before us. Those of us who are not scientists, we're the recipients of the inherited wisdom of science more often than not. And so even on questions of immunity and so forth, there's a lot of uncertainty. So there's that. There's the kind of way COVID has snuck up quite close. But then also, as one who even writes about in the Education of an Idealist, all the lost time with my young kids, because I was working a 24/7 national security job for the first 8 years of my son's life. Now I have all this time. I'd never cooked anything more than a hard-boiled egg before COVID struck, and now I've graduated to aloo gobi, although I don't know how good anything is, but beggars can't be choosers, and we have a household of hungry people. I find the homeschooling excruciating. It's the hardest thing I've ever done. Negotiating with Russia, fighting ISIS, helping end the Ebola epidemic, nothing compares to trying to get your children to treat you with the authority that you feel that your parental status entitles you to. So like many, I have a whole new admiration for what teachers are doing every day behind the scenes. And I say several Hail Marys a day for summer camp, desperate for summer camp. But right now we have it's the sort of worst of all worlds, again, feeling blessed, but the worst of all worlds in terms of kids in school, because they're in that stir crazy time of year anyway. My kids are 10 and 7. And so they'd be climbing the walls under any circumstances. But if they're climbing the walls and we're doing so even before it became silly season, and you're the one tasked with homeschooling, you take refuge in sessions like this one where you're not actually trying to get them to follow the schedule for the day. I stopped printing the schedules out a long time ago. The standards have become very, very lax, but the number of Hail Marys going up as we get closer and closer to the decision day for camp, which hasn't come yet here in Massachusetts.
Well, if this is providing you with a break, we can keep you on the air for 10, 12 hours.
If this could be a 6-hour session, there are worse things.
But Samantha, are you even, so camp was a big deal for me, and my kids went through it. They're teenagers now and older, but and enjoyed it. This year with my coworkers who have kids of that age, with thinking about camp. Are you just like, okay, this has got to happen, some camp has to happen, or are you actually thinking, all right, what would I do?
No, I'm still in the prayer mode, so I'm desperate for something that will allow them to socialize. They've had no play dates to speak of for three months. We go on bike rides occasionally where we're all masked and they meet, their friends, and then their friends are 6 feet ahead. But I think what camp offers, there is a maturing that goes on through socialization. There is the absence of the need for parental authority as well, which is a big factor. And for me, just wanting them to be doing something else other than saying to me, what's for breakfast, what's for lunch, what's for dinner, and then fighting about school assignments. But I really think there's just such value in group dynamics, group settings. For this, there's a reason other than us all, many of us working, that we don't homeschool our kids. There's something in the learning process about cohabitating and being with other kids. I'm just hoping for day camps. I've given up on overnight camps, but also just to let some energy out. Parents are trying to get their kids to go for long walks with them. That's one way to expend energy, but it's nothing like hitting a tennis ball or kicking a soccer ball or swimming in a pond. Again, these are high class problems compared to what so many families are going through. But this balance and this effort to hold it together, I know, is something that is defining parental life for so many right now.
for sure.
All right, we're gonna get you back to the easy stuff, global international relations.
Much easier.
There you go.
This COVID-19 has just brought out, I don't know, I was gonna say the worst in us, but it certainly brought out the worst in terms of global cooperation on things where most people would like to see more rather than less. There are times when I think that there's a new world order setting in which xenophobia, soaked in part by fears of contagion and the interaction, will continue to rise, and that the new world order is something a lot less interactive than what we've seen. Does that feel inevitable to you as well?
Nothing ever seems inevitable to me. Just having seen the zigs and zags of recent decades, and even in certain parts of the world in recent months. So, this is the classic, almost paradigmatic science fiction case, right? Where the alien invader comes, and Ronald Reagan even gave a speech of this nature before the General Assembly back during the Cold War, the UN General Assembly, saying, sometimes you almost wish the aliens would come so as to forge that kind of cooperation. This is the moment, right? We have so much to learn from one another. The staggered spread of the disease makes such learning, life and death. Even if we had looked ahead to what China was going through, what Italy was going through, we could have been better prepared ourselves here in the United States. The need to pool our resources in order to aid those in developing countries who don't have anywhere near the infrastructure that we have, not even clean running water in the household, overcrowded conditions that go well beyond anything, even in very crowded communities in this country. So we are connected to those countries in the sense that our supply chains might extend into a place like Bangladesh, or our family ties certainly extend into India, Nigeria, Somalia. There's no wishing away the last couple hundred years of civilization's development and interconnecting. And yet we're acting as if we can go it alone. And in the case of the United States government, really not seeing our future as linked to the fates of people living elsewhere, even though our economy, almost by definition, cannot return to normalcy to the degree that it can ever. It can't return if the markets for our products are themselves shuttered in the parts of the world, or if travel is shut off to places that are, again, critical parts of the virtual assembly line that exists around the world. So to your question, I mean, xenophobia will go up, and it has spiked in different places. A lot of it depends on leadership. So what you see in a lot of countries is that the predisposition of a leader prior to the onset of COVID tells you a lot about the extent to which that leader is preaching regional and global cooperation and solidarity right now, or looking to find scapegoats, usually for one's own mishandling of the pandemic. And so that's where, again, I don't succumb to theories of inevitability. It's about human agency. I think what gets challenging in a period like this, where already 52 countries have postponed elections or canceled elections, is how does dissent get expressed? When somebody is using their pulpit to blame the other, to blame the foreigner, to blame the minority, to blame, whatever form it may be taking, with everybody else kind of confined and, experimenting in online organizing. But how do the kinds of protests that have taken hold over the last 2 years, many of which had deleterious economic effects, but nonetheless were an expression of a lot of discontent with incumbents around the world, where does that go? Where does that energy go? And to what degree will advanced democracies that manage to get past the worst of the pandemic start to use their voices, their pressure tactics, to pay attention to what someone in Hungary or Poland may be doing to take advantage of a crisis to extend their powers, and again, to use that pulpit in a way that divides rather than unites citizens. But there are lots of examples now of the countries that have been extremely successful in managing both the economic and the health effects of the pandemic. They're doing so by bringing people together and by embracing narratives of solidarity. And now that they've begun to contain their problems, it's nice to see them beginning also to step up within international institutions and feel as if they have something to offer on behalf of those who haven't yet been walloped in the way that we know they soon will.
I mean, in our country, I feel like we're just so fragmented right here in our response. Thinking about what you did with the Obama administration when there was the Ebola outbreak, and reading more about how countries came together and what we did to lead that. I'm just, that to help us understand, first of all, some of the parallels to that situation, or maybe some of the ways that what we're seeing now departs from that. And it just doesn't feel like we're taking those lessons forward, and what's stopping us from really coming together in the ways that you're talking about.
Well, thank you for asking. I mean, the Ebola case is, of course, different, especially if we start the clock right now, where the COVID has spread to every country on the earth practically, and where you have millions of infections. Ebola started confined in West Africa, Liberia, Guinea, and Sierra Leone back in 2014. It was the worst Ebola outbreak that the world had ever seen, and the projections that we got inside the Situation Room were that 1.4 million people would be infected, even just in the region, within 4 or 5 months. And so we saw a slide that looks a lot like the kind of curves we saw and continue to see in different countries, showing that spike, and with the CDC pleading to President Obama, that we take a set of actions in order to try to bend the curve, flatten the curve, and then eventually eliminate the curve. And President Obama didn't need to be convinced. He decided that he recognized that the only way international institutions work, and this is very much true today, is if there is a catalytic leading actor, a first mover. And he recognized, just as every other president has recognized for the last 7 decades, that by and large, if it isn't the United States, it isn't anybody. And so what President Obama decided to do, despite the fact that even Democrats in his own party were very skeptical of his approach, was to send 3,000 troops and health workers into the eye of the storm, into West Africa. Donald Trump was then a reality TV show host, of course, but he would actually really came to the fore politically, in part because of the tweets that he, what's the word? I don't want to repeat the word tweeted, but emitted, the tweets that he put forth in the midst of this epidemic. And they got huge traction, not only on Fox, but they actually broke through into the mainstream and outside of, right-wing media sites. This began to spook, again, even Democratic governors and Democratic politicians. And there was a fear that if you go there to help, you'll end up bringing it here much more than would otherwise be the case. We'd already had an isolated case of somebody who'd come from Liberia. So the appeals were to close the borders. In that instance, that was the wrong approach. The public health experts in our own government made that clear. Obviously, in the COVID case, it was the right approach. It's a cost benefit in every instance. But what was the right approach was to go into the heart of the storm and then use what you're doing to leverage other countries to do far more. So we took leadership on Liberia. We went to the British and said, will you take Sierra Leone? The British said, we got this. We're just running point, backing the people of Sierra Leone who are doing the real work. The French took leadership in Guinea. We went to China and said, okay, you're ready to be part of a so-called P2. How many Ebola treatment units are you going to build in these 3 countries? How many labs are you going to set up? This is the number that we're setting up. The Malaysians contributed thousands of pairs of rubber gloves. The Cubans, more health workers and docs per capita than any other country contributing to the coalition. So this is how coalitions are built. There's a temptation to say, why doesn't the UN just snap its fingers and make it happen? Well, the UN is a building comprised of countries that are run by governments. And like any collective action problem, and we see this, I know, in the business world, often in any group setting, it requires a first mover. And the problem for the first couple months of this pandemic is that the first mover was China. China first, of course, covering up what it was doing, providing bad information. Then as a first mover, it began to first move outside of international settings, so providing bilateral assistance, not leveraging what it was doing to get other countries to chip in. The United States retreated altogether. It had already pulled back significantly, so we weren't there in the way that we have been for every other major crisis. And now, just in the last couple of weeks, China has begun to shift to try to lead within international institutions, seeing an opening to spread its wings and to cement its role as the global leader, as the leader of the world. I mean, this is what President Xi's announcement last week of a $2 billion vaccine contribution to try to pool vaccine knowledge and ultimately distribution to developing countries. He actually did that not as China bilaterally as China has usually done, but did it within the World Health Organization, where the US has vacated its premise. The other thing we're seeing, though, and I think this is really instructive in terms of a happier story about how things can develop, is that those countries like New Zealand, Australia, Korea, Denmark, Germany, that have managed to get a grip on the pandemic within their borders, have created something called the First Movers Club, and they are now seeking to pool their energies as democracies within international institutions to create a kind of bloc that offers its expertise, its resources, but also we don't want to live in a world where the China model of governance then gets imported into international institutions. And for the first 3 years of Trump's leadership, middle powers have tended to just be recessive in those organizations, kind of waiting for the United States to show up again. And now the pandemic has really brought home that, at least in this administration, is unlikely to happen, and time to get busy. If we don't want to see the norms that have defined international statecraft for the last 75 years altered and looking more and more like Chinese norms, those countries are going to have to raise their voices and take leadership roles they haven't really taken up to this point.
Okay, if you just joined us, this is HPR Quarantine. Our guest is Ambassador Samantha Power. If you have questions for her, please put them in the comments. We'll try to get to some in a little bit. Samantha, I want to take on the question. You've just written this book, Education of an Idealist. When I think of shattered idealism for myself, I view myself as an idealist, and I find, governments let you down, NGOs let you down, almost everything lets you down. I actually find solace sometimes in the world of business. I don't mean to overstate business as good as opposed to being neutral, but there are companies that within the ecosystem of a business can try to do the right thing and to try to create an environment that cares about whatever issues matter, environmental, social governance, sort of other things, these little microcosms. So my question for you is, where does an American idealist like yourself find solace these days?
Thank you. I mean, I think that some of the trends that we've seen with business leaders well before the pandemic, stepping up and saying it's not just about the bottom line. I mean, this trend has been at work, and it's never entirely clear what's motivating a particular leader in a particular circumstance, but more and more seeing the Business Roundtable and others step up and take note of the warming planet around us, companies that have been able to get through this pandemic without big blows, stepping into the void where charities and others are really flailing. I just saw last week Oxfam pulling out of 18 countries because they can no longer pay the bills there. UN humanitarian work all around the world shriveling up as resources get diverted to deal with really difficult domestic circumstances for developed countries. And so for the private sector to do more of that, I mean, again, it comes back to individual agency. In my own career, as I write about in the book, I just saw too often individuals change the world. And it may be that the slice of the world that they changed was small. Again, the climate kept warming, even as we were able, in support of the people in West Africa, to bring the Ebola epidemic to an end. But if you set your sights on changing everything at once, then that is a recipe for disillusionment. And maybe just watching The Last Dance over and over and not changing the world around you, it can be really tempting to turn off if you think you can solve the biggest problems of our time either by yourself or all at once. So I fastened, when I was in government, on an idea that actually writers who I think are beloved in the business world, the Heath brothers, they wrote a book called Switch, and they had this idea, and it really resonated for me in government, which was shrink the change, find that small slice of change that actually is within your scope. So, for example, when I was in the cabinet of the President of the United States as UN ambassador, at the very time I was at the highest levels of government, we were experiencing something that continues to this day, which is a human rights recession all around the world. We're now in the 14th straight year of human rights being in decline. Now, we had an explosive growth in human rights and civil society and so forth after the end of the Cold War, but those trend lines have gone in a negative direction, in part because of the xenophobia and nationalism you mentioned earlier. But I'm thinking, here I am, human rights advocate, actually at the highest levels of government. What am I doing about the human rights recession? And if you ask the question in that way, again, you could just feel immensely small. And I think people right now, given the crisis, are feeling very, very small and disempowered. But instead, I sat down with my team and I read about this in the book. And I said, what can we do that's just a tiny piece of this? And we decided we were going to set our sights on just getting 20 female political prisoners out of jail. It was so modest for the U.S. government to be doing this next to all these years of freedom in decline. But we profiled each of these women on social media. Some were exposing corruption in their government. Some were protesting sexual harassment in China. And we hung jumbo photos of these women in the U.S. mission to the UN in the window when heads of state were coming to town in September for the General Assembly. We teamed up in a bipartisan way, the forgotten practice of bipartisan-backed diplomacy, where we got the 20 U.S. female senators who were in the U.S. Senate at the time, a Republican and Democrat, to back the campaign. And 16 of the 20 women were ultimately freed from jail and went back to making trouble and holding their governments accountable. And I use this example not because it by any means changed the world, but to describe the effect on my team and the way that they went about their business, the tangible nature of that, which was so concrete and yes, so small, next to the abstraction of freedom in decline. People who in COVID are now, created these shopping angels networks. I know just shopping for elderly neighbors, gives you a sense of meaning and purpose and impact. So you can't change all of these structural trends that are defining our plight at a given moment, but it is a mistake to think that you can come up with usually a solution commensurate with the scale of the challenge. The question is, what is your slice? And I think in thinking that way, it breeds an idealism and a greater sense of empowerment.
Now, can we, I know we've got some other things that we want to talk about on the sports front and everything, but I wanted one kind of big, still sort of big, heavy question for you, because I'm curious what you think about the whole notion of national security and what it feels at the very least like we've broadened the definition of it. It feels like the definition is changing of what that really means. And it kind of seems like it has some scary implications. And I'm wondering what your thinking on that is.
Yeah, I mean, I think that rhetorically it has been altered for some time. We have talked about national security as entailing threats that cross borders. We rhetorically, certainly since 9/11 at the very least, have talked about, the ways that borders don't insulate us from terrorists who can move their finances in a different way or slip into a country under one kind of visa and do dangerous things. We've had the rhetoric also about pandemics in every national security strategy, I think, at least again since 9/11. But our resource allocations are absolutely overweighted toward believing that military force is our national security weapon of first, second, third, fourth, and fifth resort. And so you see colossal underinvestments, for example, in the Centers for Disease Control or in public health infrastructure as compared to what we would invest in the wars that we are fighting in multiple theaters around the world. So I think that the challenge now as we look forward is, how do we resource appropriately the global threats that don't respect borders? And that includes resourcing international institutions that are themselves, unfortunately, the amalgamation of the national interests of the governments that comprise those institutions. Namely, China's going to have a bigger and bigger say in how those institutions work as they become a bigger and bigger donor to those institutions. So that's going to make our path in those international institutions more challenging, but there's no workaround For global threats, you've got to work with other countries on the globe by definition and find vehicles and venues to do that. We don't have the ability to walk away from China in a climate discussion when China is the #1 emitter of carbon. We did that option's not available to us. So how do we look out for those global threats, strengthen those international institutions and even those collaborations with those we vehemently disagree with on a whole host of other issues? How do you compartmentalize competition? More than that, though, how, as part of dealing with global threats, particularly, again, the non-traditional ones like pandemics and climate security, how do you bring non-traditional actors much more into those international coalitions than they have been? I mean, I know from my time at the UN that, yes, governments talk a good game about multi-stakeholder initiatives and private-public partnerships, but it's states that drive the response. States have to drive a significant share of the response, given their significant share of responsibility and the resources they can bring to bear. But the private sector actors, philanthropists like Bill Gates, doing so much more than probably more than 2/3 of the countries within the UN in this pandemic, they need to have much more significant, respected voices in the decision-making of these bodies. And so those bodies are going to have to get modernized, and the complexion of who's participating is going to have to change. At the same time, the traditional great power threats haven't gone anywhere. So the notion that we might have had right after the Cold War, that everybody was trending in a liberal democratic direction, that, of course, has been dispelled with Putin's reassertion of Russian power via 18th century tools like taking over parts of other countries, but also China and the way it coercively makes its way through the South China Sea, the way it also leverages its economic statecraft to secure really different outcomes within the UN that are going to be very detrimental to our interests. This is going to be a very combative relationship with China on a whole series of fronts, including, of course, the economic front for some time. But we don't have the option of just privileging the great power competition and confrontation over managing those global threats. So it's going to take a subtlety and a sophistication of statecraft that we really haven't seen, because it's not all or nothing where we throw out the old playbook. When great power conflict and tension exists, that old playbook still has something to teach us, but it requires a much more creative use of the tools in the toolbox and much less reliance on military force, which frankly has largely drained American capital and prevented us, I think, from seeing this fuller picture that has existed for some time.
I do love that phrase, by the way. How do you compartmentalize competition? I mean, it just seems to speak to, we're going to have to work with partners, countries, different actors that we might not be so thrilled about, but you basically have to do it. I do worry, and I wonder if you worry, that in a time when we move forward, when we have fewer and fewer resources, as we move inevitably into tougher economic times and paying for all this debt, I think, aren't you concerned? It feels like the challenge you're putting forward is even greater to resource against, whether it's military versus some of the things you're talking about.
I think it's absolutely, it's hard for two reasons. One, it's a resource constrained environment, but two, I think, to come back to a point that one of you made before, we're just so polarized that the risk is whoever the president is, that there's a polarized reaction to what he or she eventually is putting forward. And so, if you actually believed what we're talking about, which is that, and believe what we've, and institutionalize lessons from what we are continuing to experience with the pandemic, this is national security. Americans, even in hard times, invest in protecting one another. American leaders invest in protecting their citizens. If you take to a natural conclusion the gravity of this risk, then it requires making room for those investments in international infrastructure. But the challenge is, because we are divided on that question, because at least for now, the head of the Republican Party has not embraced the idea that protecting our security requires strengthening our alliances and working in coalitions within international institutions. that is likely to be a very divisive issue at a time when resources are going to be scarce. So it's the worst combination. So I worry very much about that.
Yeah.
All right, so let's go into a lightning round. We have a little bit of time, but I do want to get a couple of questions. Maybe we get quick questions, quick answers. This is from Ada in the UK. What advice do you have for other women who want to work in the field of national security?
Well, I write in the Education of an Idealist a lot about that, because the truth is, having been a journalist and human rights advocate on the outside, I hadn't really been so self-conscious of being a woman in the workplace until I went and worked in national security. And I say it would be the same in the UK. It's just amazing how you can look around some meetings and feel as if you're in 1945. And that became even more dramatically the case when I got to the United Nations, which still has never had a female secretary general, and where fewer than a quarter of the ambassadors are female, which resembles actually the percentage of women represented in the U.S. Senate and House of Representatives until the 2018 election. So in some ways, what goes on at the UN and what goes on in national security is out of step with certain sectors where women have made more headway, at least in terms of equitable representation. But in certain respects, it's reflective of politics and public policy life more generally. What do I recommend? What I learned the hard way was that the solidarity that women bring to the workplace is everything. Again, I didn't self-identify so much. I was having some trouble in the early days of my time working at the White House as President Obama's human rights advisor. I thought, is it because I'm new to government and because I used to be a journalist, people think that I'm a journalist kind of almost undercover at the White House? Like are my ideas not being taken as seriously as I might like because of something to do with me? Is it because I'm the human rights advisor, which is sometimes likened to being the skunk at the lawn party? Because there were a lot of habits in national security that cut in a pretty traditional statist direction and don't like the confrontation sometimes involved in raising human rights concerns. So I'm thinking, but all of my questions were, it must be me. I just need to get better and I need to improve. Then I sat down with the other female so-called special assistants to the president. There were 6 of us out of 26 all told, 26 special assistants all told. And each of these women, one was working on non-proliferation, another had come from the Pentagon, it was in charge of European affairs. They'd been around the block. They weren't promoting human rights. They weren't novices in the US government. They weren't former journalists, and they were having exactly the same issues. And once we each came together and understood that something in the culture was a little bit amiss, we were much better ourselves at raising collective concerns and being able to say what was us and what was the culture and pushing back. And I brought that spirit when I was UN ambassador to that job and created a group for all the female ambassadors to come together. We had dinner about, psychology and the confidence code. We brought the authors of the confidence code to talk through how we were holding ourselves back at times. I had Gloria Steinem come to dinner, Madeleine Albright, first female U.S. Secretary of State. And so, but we also brainstormed about what we could do as a network on issues related to sexual violence or on representation of women within the UN system. So I think there's strength in numbers. And even though our numbers sometimes in the boardroom or in the situation room aren't what they will be and need to be, the numbers that you have can actually be quite potent if you find one another.
So we have to ask, you are a well-known, outspoken Red Sox fan. How are you surviving without sports, other than it sounds like watching and maybe rewatching The Last Dance over and over again?
It's actually Dave Roberts' steal, where I have a son, Declan, who's a Washington Nationals fanatic. And you won't believe it, but he's trying to convince me that Derek Jeter actually applied the tag to Dave Roberts' critical steal in 2004. So wow. We're having a pitched verbal battle. No, it's
that is
you just got to watch it over and over again to find out.
I think
we tried Korean baseball.
Homeschool.
It didn't go over well. The combination of just not knowing the play, there's just too much of an investment. I mean, baseball's all about the reward on investment. So The Last Dance has been a little bit of offered some solace, different sport, but a nice way to remember what sports offers all of us, and a family bonding device. But we're hopeful that they're going to get baseball back. It's not going to look like it used to, but my son, I should note, because he's a Washington Nationals fan, he's pretty mixed. He watches 162 games a year. He's a fanatic, but he's a little bit torn between getting to be the World Series champion forever, the sort of perennial, but mommy,
If they never play again,
here probably. And so when he thinks about empty stadiums, not being able to have a full season, having lost Anthony Rendon, and he weights that against actually just being able to call himself world champion for longer, he's more torn than you'd expect.
Your greatest moment of international diplomacy was when you thanked the Japanese government for the 2 Japanese relief pitchers who helped deliver the World Series to the Red Sox a few years ago. That was a good moment.
Thank you for remembering.
All right, so quickly, we like to do a little segment called Here Today or Here to Stay. And let's just do really quick on that. Josh, you wanna do one?
Okay, so graduation rituals. I have a daughter who's leaving high school this spring, and it is clearly, there we go. There's the sign. Now this sign is one, and dogs too. My dogs, which you didn't hear today. I think you heard Audie's dogs.
Sorry about that.
That's okay. But this is actually a sign that's a line of signs, a mile long, with each individual's name on it. You can go take your picture with it. And it's just such a great way, I think, when you can't have the big, when we can't all congregate. And I've seen many, many different ways that we see people celebrating these milestones that are kind of fun and interesting, and maybe even a little bit better than sitting through that long high school graduation. Not that I was going to mind it, Charlotte. But I sort of hope that stays on long after this moment. I don't know what you guys think.
Yeah, I love these. I spoke to somebody, a parent who was present at a kind of a Zoom version of their child's college graduation, and it's not the way you want to do it. But on the other hand, she said there was an intimacy with the speaker that you don't necessarily get if you're in a stadium and tens of thousands of kids are graduating and there's a tiny little speaker far, far away from you. So there's actually something positive. I love these things on the street. I really hope we I hope we keep appreciating frontline workers, and I hope we keep appreciating health workers, and I hope we appreciate graduates the way we have. I mean, the pandemic has driven us apart, but it's the moments when we've realized new ways to connect have been really moving, and I hope they do survive.
Yeah, I was slated to give 4 commencement speeches, and talk about needing to learn to say no. And this struck, and I had already begun to think about the different I was doing 2 high schools and 2 universities, and so it's sort of an interesting, kind of sort of insight into what different schools are doing. So one of the universities I was supposed to speak at canceled altogether and is having, no Zoom anything, unfortunately. Another asked for a written ode to the graduating class. And among the high schools, one of them, which is here in Massachusetts, I'm actually going, I think it's at the end of this week or next week, and standing at an empty podium, and they're doing the live stream. So they'll be talking about Korean baseball. Weird. It'll be hard to get used to, but I think to the degree that one of the things I'm really looking forward to, and I just have my fingers crossed that as a professor myself, that the students are going to be back on campus in the fall. But I do think that all of the things that you take for granted about the social, about those after class conversations you have with the professor, or among students, just the spontaneity and so forth. I think that when we go back, and it won't look the same. Yes, classes will be not as crowded, and people will be walking in one direction and wear masks and this and that. But the one thing that would be great to be different when we do return is just that smelling of the roses, right? Of group dynamics, group settings, of in-person friendships. Just, it's so stilted in a way because you have to call up and, can we have a Zoom, drink, or can we have a Zoom flirtation, or can we, and to just be looking around and anything that makes us not take for granted, the joys that we have that become kind of part of our wallpaper. I think that could be a lovely benefit on the back end when we do come back together.
Yeah, I agree.
All right, so I want to thank Ambassador Samatha Power for being our guest today on HBR Quarantine. Really generous of you to give us a lot of your time, and good luck surviving this very, very strange moment going forward.
You too. Thank you so much for having me. Thanks for all the great comments too.
Thank you. Thanks, Samantha.
And Josh, you want to talk about our guest next week?
Sure. Our guest next week, which next week it'll be Monday, just the normal Monday when HBR Quarantine resumes, with Adam Grant, who's a psychologist and a professor at Wharton School of Business at the University of Pennsylvania. Adam will talk with us a little bit about remote collaboration during this time, as well as keeping that company culture or not keeping it, I guess. That's what we'll have to talk to him about. What is it that companies want to do and take from this moment moving forward? So that should be a great conversation. Also, just to remind you, the shameless plug for HBR, if you enjoy what you're seeing here and you want to get more of this, go to hbr.org where you can subscribe. And I just want to thank you all for coming this week, and I hope you have a great rest of your week. So long.
Okay, we're back on.
So we're back, and we know we're back.
We know we're back. We're back.
We like to come back after the show to do a quick little post-mortem on the show. So that's what this is.
Now, why didn't you talk about my blazer?
Oh, yeah. Sorry. Well, this is the time now. Josh, look, blazer.
Nice blazer.
Yeah,
I know.
nice blazer.
I dressed up for the show, the ambassador and the show.
Yeah. So I thought you were great. I thought there was a lot of really interesting ideas and things to think about. We had a lot of questions that I wish I'd gotten to, but
a ton.
But we went long.
Were there any questions that you think of as memorable that we didn't get to?
Well, I mean, there were people who wanted to know.
What's that?
Yeah, sorry about the dog. All right, that was kind of a nightmare on my side. I had children walking around in the background. I had dogs barking.
But he wasn't in his boxers, at least. I mean, I felt like any moment now, someone was like coming in with a cigarette, bathrobe.
That was just pure chance that it was.
It could have been Dave, even. I was just like, this is stuff I don't want to see.
Yeah, so we have to work on that.
You gotta work backstage in your whatever it is where you are right now.
But there were definitely questions. People wanted to hear more from Samantha about how COVID-19 has impacted America's reputation, as a global leader. And I would have been interested in hearing more about that. Let's see, what are some others? There was one to learn more about Ebola, which obviously was very different in the response and the kind of coalition that existed, but whether there were more kind of overt lessons that could be extracted from that and applied to the current situation.
Yeah, I think one of the big parallels, that she resonates with me talking about is what we do in business all the time. What we write about is how you divide those resources. When she started talking, just so much about the overweighted to the military response, and then how do you move resources? She's really, what a great commencement speaker she would be.
Yeah, no.
The other thing about sports, this is such a strange time for those of us who, for whom sports is an important part of our kind of daily rituals. The sports station in Boston, in the area, last night was playing a replay of the first Super Bowl from 1967, just kind of playing it with all the pregame stuff, and without kind of, it wasn't highlights. It was just beginning to end, 3.5 hours of the first Super Bowl to an audience. Green Bay against Kansas City.
Green Bay.
Kansas City, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
It wasn't even called the Super Bowl then. That's how long ago it was.
Big game.
So,
yeah.
For those of us who are just starved for something.
I'd be interested to know, did they do original advertisements, and what was an ad buy for the Super Bowl like back in 1961? That would have been, but then again, I think
it was all just like real tobacco. I want to know who the musician was at halftime.
Yeah, that's true. Don Ho, I think.
No, that's before Dawn's time.
Maybe.
Yeah, maybe. Wow, that really dates me. If I
It was
come up
probably
with a
Ethel- I was
ridiculously
probably Ethel Merman.
dated,
Yeah.
I set you up for that. There you go.
yeah. Okay, well that was good. We should do this again next week.
Yep,
Sure.
on Monday.
All
All
right.
right, I'll see you.
See you on
next-
Monday. Thanks for tuning in.
All right. See ya.
Real goodbye.
Real goodbye.